This is for Palestine, Ramallah, West Bank, Gaza. This is for the child that is searching for an answer. This is not just a war over stolen land. Why do you think little boys are throwing stones at tanks? And we'll never really know how many people are dead. They drop bombs on innocent girls while they sleep in their bed. Israel is a terror state, they're terrorists that terrorize. I'll testify my television, televise, I'm telling lies. How many more resolutions have to be violated? How many more children have to be annihilated? This is not a war, it is systematic genocide. But whatever they try, Palestine will never die. Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine!
Hello, I'm Chris Williamson, and you're watching Palestine Declassified. We're the only weekly TV show focusing on investigating and exposing the Israeli regime's global war against solidarity with the illegally occupied people of Palestine. In this week's show, we'll be looking into the enduring impact of General Qassem Soleimani, who was assassinated in a US drone strike that was authorised by the then US President Donald Trump in 2020. Trump is hoping to make a political comeback later this year. But while he's reviled by large sections of the US public, Qassem Soleimani is universally loved across the global south. Latifa Abu Chakra has been looking back at Soleimani's trailblazing influence in Palestine and beyond.
Qassem Soleimani's killing by the United States in January 2020 shocked and enraged the leaders of the world, particularly those in the global south who knew him so well. His contributions to the cause of freedom are legendary. The illegal execution of General Qassem Soleimani by the US was a heinous act by a petulant empire pushed by Israel and aided by powerful local actors in Iraq. However, the words of his enemies will never define Qassem Soleimani. All Palestinian resistance factions recognize and appreciate Soleimani's contributions to the cause. He was instrumental in arming all Palestinian resistance groups, from Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad to the PFLP and even Fatah. According to Talal Naji, the PFLP Secretary General, Iran supplied all Palestinian resistance factions, including Fatah, with weaponry carried by ship. Naji also claims that in order for the Gaza factions to establish their own means of resistance, the late Qassem Soleimani's tutelage was essential in constructing the procedures by which the factions produced their own means of defense. Naji emphasized how primitive the defense capabilities were prior to that. The training took place in the Islamic Republic, Syria, and Lebanon under the auspices of General Qassem Soleimani. Talal Naji went on to say, were it not for the principled support and positions of the Islamic Republic of Iran, the victories of the axes of resistance in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen would not have happened today. The current Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, also has been the target of many US assassination attempts, has openly spoken of his strong ties with the late resistance commander, General Qassem Soleimani. Maduro speaks warmly of a time when Venezuela was targeted by US hacking. It was Soleimani who arrived and offered to protect Venezuela's systems from North American intrigues. In a sincere gesture of support, Palestinians were seen last year carving his portrait into the seashore of Gaza. You will know them by the company they keep, and Qassem Soleimani was the friend of millions across the global south.
As always, we're joined by our resident expert, David Miller. David's an academic and a former professor at Bristol University, and is a leading British scholarly critic of Israel. David's also the co-founder and co-director of the lobbying watchdog Spinwatch. Our guest contributor today is Vanessa Beeley, who joined us earlier. Vanessa is a fearless investigative and photojournalist, and the legendary John Pilger, who tragically passed away on the 30th of December, described Vanessa as a fine journalist and gave her his unqualified endorsement. In 2017, she was a finalist for the prestigious Martha Gellhorn Prize for Journalism. In 2018, she was named as one of the 238 most respected journalists in the UK by the British National Council for the Training of Journalists. And in 2019, Vanessa was among the recipients of the Serena Shim Award for uncompromising integrity in journalism. Welcome to the show. David, I wonder whether you could just explain exactly how General Qassem Soleimani aided the resistance in Palestine.
Well, as you saw in the film there, all of the resistance factions were aided by Soleimani and indeed by the Islamic Republic of Iran. And when we say all, people of course don't necessarily know what all the factions are. Let's recall that in Gaza, there is an operations room which controls all of the resistance activities against the Zionist entity, and there are 10 different armed factions involved in that operations room. Of course, people know about Hamas. They quite often refer to the Qassem brigades, which is the military wing of Hamas, by the term Hamas, which is, of course, incorrect. People know a little bit, perhaps, about the Al-Quds brigades, which is the armed wing of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, but there are another 8 factions, including the Al-Aqsa Martyrs, the Mujahideen, etc., which are all involved, including secularist and leftist organisations, as well as more Islamically orientated. Most of them are mostly Islamically orientated. So that all of those factions were supported by Soleimani, including, as the film shows there, Fatah, an organisation which is associated with the Al-Aqsa Martyrs brigades, who are fighting in Gaza, but of course is also associated with the Palestinian Authority, which collaborates against the resistance. So it's a complicated picture. But all of these factions were supported. No fear or favour to one. It's often said that the Palestinian Islamic Jihad is closest to Iran, but Iran and Soleimani supported all of the factions.
Right, yeah. Well, I started by asking Vanessa about Soleimani's role in Syria and Iraq.
Well, I think Sayed Qassem Soleimani had a very instrumental role, particularly in Syria, where, of course, I'm based. Soleimani was responsible for Russia entering the war in Syria in 2015 in September, when the Syrian Arab Army was struggling with basically the hordes of Western-backed and sponsored terrorists, including ISIS, that were taking large swathes of Syrian territory. And of course, the Russian intervention, and particularly the Air Force intervention, managed to push back the ISIS forces into the northeast of Syria.
David, the only armed forces of the Arab world that's actually defending Palestinians at the moment is Yemen, isn't it? And it's the armed forces, not a militia, isn't it, that's actually providing that support?
That's right. Well, people refer to often in the mainstream media the Houthis as
yes.
what's happening, and as if it's some kind of rebel group which is threatening these boats and caused a total blockade of the Red Sea. But of course, that's not the case. And since 2015, Ansar Allah, the movement which was fighting a war or against a Saudi-backed intervention, has become the government. Effectively, controls 85% of the country. There's a small token presence of the other contested government in Yemen, but it can't even. It's not even based in Yemen. It's based in a luxury hotel in Saudi.
I then asked Vanessa what her reading of the situation in Gaza is now.
The situation in Gaza now is an ongoing genocide against the Palestinian people there, but not only in Gaza, also in West Bank. It's, of course, a publicly declared genocide, declared by members of the far-right Zionist regime, including Netanyahu effectively himself. But at the same time, of course, we've actually seen a resounding defeat of the Israeli occupation forces on the ground inside Gaza, where the casualty rate is much higher than is being admitted by the Zionist regime, where effectively, for example, the Jolani brigade has pulled out of northern Gaza, and where they are incurring not only casualties but loss of armored vehicles, tanks, bulldozers on an almost daily basis. And so therefore, overall, this is a resounding defeat for the Zionist regime. If they can't withstand an on-the-ground urban warfare against a relatively poorly equipped resistance force made up of various factions inside Gaza, how are they going to confront on-the-ground forces like Hezbollah, for example?
David, just say a word or two as well with you about what Palestinian leaders say about Soleimani.
Well, all the Palestinian leaders are very, very positive about Soleimani. I mean, let's recall, going back, there was a split, wasn't there, between effectively Iran
Indeed.
and Hamas,
Yes.
at least, not the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, over the question of Syria,
Yes.
because Hamas largely backed the other side in the attempt to topple the Assad government, which of course was backed by NATO and which involved Britain and the Americans as well. But that split between a period of, say, 2011 for 4 or 5 years has now been very effectively healed. And it's even been the case, of course, that the Syrian government have been supplying a support to Hamas along with the Iranians. But of course, the main kind of support that comes to not just the Palestinian factions, but also to the axis of resistance more generally, comes from the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Yeah. Well, I then asked Vanessa about the action on the Golan Heights side of things.
Yeah, I mean, basically what Syria has been doing since October the 7th, and we have actually seen the resistance axis responding in a very controlled fashion. Why? Because, of course, they know that what the Israeli handlers, that is the UK, the US, and EU member states want is an escalation, a regional escalation. And in Syria, of course, Syria is facing hostile occupation and annexation of its territory from the north down to the southeast, including by Israel in the south. So rather than responding to the provocations that are coming on an almost daily basis from the Zionist regime, including another bombing of Syrian artillery positions last night, or rather the early hours of this morning, what they have done in Syria is to open up territory within Syria for the Palestinian resistance factions and the Islamic resistance factions to carry out attacks on the US occupation bases, but also on the Zionist-occupied Golan territories.
Well, I asked Vanessa then about the respect that the Russians had for Soleimani.
Absolutely. As I said, it was thanks to Soleimani's discussions with President Putin and with members of his administration that Russia actually intervened in September 2015. So there was a tremendous amount of respect for Soleimani, actually in all the countries of what I would call the resistance axis against Western imperialism and neocolonialism.
David, what do you make of Trump's comments regarding Israel's role in the killing of Soleimani?
Well, they're curious, aren't they? I mean, we don't know exactly what they meant, but he's referring presumably to some kind of pressure or information passed to the Americans by the Israelis, which is part of the operation, which must have been deceptive or unfairly pressuring. And of course, Trump is very, odd character. One of the, really very much like I think Elon Musk. There's a kind of strange libertarianism.
No, indeed.
But the difficulty with that libertarianism in the US context is it finds it very difficult to break free of Zionism. And of course, in his own family, he has some very strong Zionist influences, like Jared Kushner, for example, who's in particular aligned with the extremist Chabad organization, which we've talked about in this show before. Yes. So, so Trump is a very kind of interesting and conflicted character. So he, on the one hand, he wants to be an isolationist and not pursue the kind of projecting US power overseas. On the other hand, the counterterrorism apparatus and the intelligence agencies would appear to be able to influence him and make sure that he doesn't carry out his sort of threats to be much more isolationist, which of course would mean less involvement in assassinating people like Soleimani and the like.
Absolutely. Well, I then asked Vanessa about the apparent involvement of the US Delta Force in Gaza, considering its role in the killing of Qassem Soleimani.
Yeah, I assume you mean the participation of the Delta Force in the assassination of General Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes. Yes. Look, the US and the UK consistently use what they call special forces in their arenas of destabilization or regime change or territory grab, either by proxy or directly, as they've done both in Syria. And these special forces, whether it's Delta Force or others, are here actively on the ground in Syria, both British and American and other NATO member states, operating alongside the Al-Qaeda dominated terrorists in the northwest, but also particularly in the south and southeast and in the northeast, where of course the US has its occupation, unlawful occupation, military bases. And so therefore the appearance of the Delta Force in the occupied territories, and one assumes in Gaza fighting alongside the IOF, and there were reports of them overseeing the use of nerve gas against the resistance factions in the tunnels that haven't yet come to fruition, but I think a lot of publicity of that plan potentially derailed it. So it's not surprising that we see this involvement of, let's say, the clandestine forces under the control largely of the deep state and the clandestine intelligence agencies in the US and the UK.
David, just say what it's really about which Palestinian factions was Soleimani and Iran involved in arming. I think it basically across the piece, isn't it?
It is, and that's right. I mean, so the quote we saw there was from the PFLP. Now, again, people don't know much about all these the sort of alphabet soup of Palestinian factions, but the PFLP is two factions, two different factions: Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine and the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine General Command, which of course is an organisation largely been based in recent years in Damascus in Syria. So those organisations are leftist, secular. Secularist, but they're involved along with the other Islamic factions, such as the Qassem Brigades or the Al-Quds Brigades, the Palestinian Mujahideen, and these are all being armed by the Iranians, and part of the strategy has been to try and bring the resistance together, and that's been one of the key developments which has underpinned what's happened after October the 7th, in which many of the factions, at least 5 of the factions, took part in, and that sort of rapprochement between the different wings of the Palestinian resistance movement was brought about in part by negotiations and the help from Soleimani and from the IRGC, the Quds force, the overseas force of the Islamic Republican Guards. So that this is the role that Iran has played has been very significant, but of course it's also not the case that Iran directs these factions as proxies, and you can see that doesn't happen because they have all sorts of different politics themselves. So these are what happened on October the 7th. There's a Palestinian initiative carried out by the Palestinian factions, but of course the support that Iran gives to both the Palestinian factions and indeed, of course, to Hezbollah and to the Syrian government is very significant indeed in terms of not just money and weapons, but also the technology of making the weapons, which of course has been the case, for example, with Yemen, where the technology has been passed to them and they can then make their own weapons.
Of course. Well, I then asked Vanessa for her overall impression of Soleimani's legacy.
Actually, that he is more dangerous as a martyr than he was even as General Soleimani in life. Because where the US completely underestimated, or perhaps don't have any understanding of the culture of martyrdom that exists within much of the resistance axis, is when someone as iconic as General Soleimani is martyred by the very forces that he is uniting the resistance against. What does this do? This strengthens the resistance. And of course, it helps to recruit new members to that resistance. So what the US has done by assassinating not only Soleimani, but also Mohandes, and even more recently, Sayed Razi Mousavi, will only be to strengthen the resistance long term and to increase the unity of the resistance across the countries that make up the resistance axis. I mean, for example, we know that Soleimani was involved in the normalization between various members of the Axis and various members of the Palestinian resistance factions, particularly after the war against Syria. Also, of course, Said Nasrallah, the Hezbollah General Secretary, was also heavily involved in that. But, you know, Soleimani's legacy has to be the unity of the resistance and the understanding of the new generation of what it means to be a part of that resistance and what exactly they are fighting against.
Well, I'm afraid we're out of time, so that's it for another show. I'd like to thank our guest, Vanessa Beeley, and of course our resident expert, Professor David Miller. Palestine Declassified will be back next week with more forensic investigations and analysis. But in the meantime, you can follow the show on Facebook, Twitter and Telegram, where we post regular clips and updates. And remember to share today's programme on your social media platforms to help us continue to keep growing our audience. So until next time, this is Chris Williamson saying bye for now.